This is also a time of change for my family. Catherine, she became Queen Consort. In recognition,
Charles had read the letter twice before he allowed himself to accept that it was genuine. The paper was old enough that the fold lines had gone soft, worn down by handling rather than time alone, and the handwriting on it belonged unmistakably to Camilla, dated to a period long before either of them had imagined the shape their lives would eventually take. He sat with it in a small room at Sandringham that had once belonged to his grandmother, a room chosen precisely because it offered no view of the grounds and no possibility of being observed through a window by staff crossing the lawn. What the letter described was not a confession of affection or a private complaint about palace life. It was something considerably more calculated, written in the careful, deliberate hand of a woman who had understood, even then, that the institution she was quietly working her way into required patience, measured in decades rather than years. Before we go further, I want to be honest with you about the nature of what you're about to hear. This account draws on public reporting, patterns described by sources close to the royal household across multiple outlets, documented institutional history, and reasoned analysis. Some elements involve interpretation and informed speculation, offered here for commentary and discussion rather than as confirmed fact. This isn't a news broadcast, and I'd ask that you hold it with that understanding even as we walk through everything the letter reportedly contains and what it appears to reveal about Camilla's long, unhurried path toward the position she holds today. If you're new to this channel, go ahead and subscribe now, because there's a great deal more to this story, and we'll be following every part of it as it develops. The letter, according to people who have described its contents to those close to the royal household, was written in the early 2000s, several years before Charles and Camilla's marriage was made official, during a period when Camilla's public standing remained fragile, and the question of whether she would ever be publicly accepted, let alone crowned, was considered by most observers to be a matter of significant doubt. It was addressed not to Charles but to a close friend, someone within Camilla's own circle, rather than the royal household's formal structure, which is precisely why it had never surfaced through any of the channels the palace typically monitors. Private correspondence between friends does not pass through the same archival systems as official communications. It survives, when it survives at all, in personal collections, boxes of old letters kept for sentimental reasons long after their original context has faded from public relevance. What makes this letter different from the dozens of unverified claims that circulate about Camilla every year is the specificity of what it reportedly contains. She did not write vaguely about hoping for eventual acceptance. She wrote, according to accounts of the letter's language, with the clear-eyed precision of someone assessing a long campaign. She described the public's hostility toward her as something that would soften gradually, not because attitudes would spontaneously change, but because the institution itself would manage that softening deliberately, through carefully staged public appearances, through the slow accumulation of ordinary moments that would make her seem less like an intruder and more like a fixture. She wrote about titles with a frankness that would have been remarkable, coming from anyone inside that world, discussing the difference between what she would be permitted to hold immediately and what she believed, given enough patience, she would eventually be granted. The word queen appeared in that letter, not as a hope, as an expectation, qualified only by timing. Stop and consider what that actually means. This was not written after the marriage, when such ambitions might be understood as the natural progression of a woman settling into a role already conferred upon her. It was written years earlier, while Diana's memory was still raw in the national consciousness, while Camilla herself occupied a position so publicly precarious that senior aides had reportedly advised her to avoid any appearance of ambition whatsoever. And yet here, in a private letter never intended for public eyes, she had already mapped the trajectory she expected her life to follow, and mapped it, according to the language reportedly used, with confidence, rather than uncertainty. We're going to get into exactly how this letter came to surface, and what it has done inside the palace walls since it did. But first, you need to understand who Camilla actually was during the years this letter was written, because the woman constructing that private assessment bears very little resemblance to the caricature that dominated tabloid coverage at the time. Camilla Shand grew up in a family with old money and older social instincts, the kind of upbringing that teaches a person to read a room before they've learned to read anything else. Her relationship with Charles began in the early 1970s, was interrupted by circumstances that have been documented extensively elsewhere, and resumed decades later under conditions that made her, for the better part of 2 decades, one of the most reviled women in modern British public life. The affair, the divorce, Diana's death, and the public's insistence on assigning blame somewhere concrete enough to hold. Camilla absorbed the weight of nearly all of it, publicly silent, in a way that her critics interpreted as guilt, and her defenders interpreted as discipline. What almost nobody outside her closest circle understood at the time was how deliberately she was thinking about the years ahead. She was, by every account that has emerged since, a woman who understood institutions the way a chess player understands an opponent's habitual openings. She had watched Diana burn through the public's affection at a speed that ultimately consumed her, had watched the monarchy struggle to contain a figure whose relationship with visibility was fundamentally different from its own careful, managed relationship with the press. Camilla drew a different lesson from that spectacle than most observers assumed she would. She did not conclude that public affection was something to chase. She concluded that it was something to be built slowly, the way trust is built between strangers who expect to know each other for a very long time. The letter, according to people who have described it, reflects exactly that thinking. It is patient in a way that borders on strategic, in the most literal sense of the word. And it raises an uncomfortable question that the palace has spent the better part of 2 decades avoiding having to answer directly. Was Camilla's gradual public rehabilitation, culminating in her coronation as queen alongside Charles, something that simply happened to her as the natural consequence of enough time passing? Or was it something she worked toward with the same deliberate patience the letter describes, using every available lever, public and private, to move herself steadily closer to a position that, decades earlier, she had privately already claimed as her expectation? Stay with this, because the answer to that question is precisely what the letter's surfacing has forced several people inside the palace to confront, and what it means for how Charles now understands the marriage he has spent more than 20 years building. The letter reportedly surfaced through a source considerably more mundane than any palace intrigue. According to accounts that have circulated among people close to the household, it emerged during the process of cataloging the estate of a woman who had died earlier this year, a longtime friend of Camilla's from decades before her marriage. Someone who had kept boxes of old correspondence in the way people of a certain generation often do, unsorted and unremarkable, until someone with reason to look closely finally does. The estate's executor, working through papers with no expectation of finding anything of public interest, recognized Camilla's handwriting and, understanding the potential sensitivity, contacted a solicitor with connections to the royal household, rather than simply discarding or archiving the material. What happened next moved with the particular caution that surrounds anything touching the monarchy's private history. The solicitor did not go to the press. He went, according to people familiar with the sequence of events, to a trusted intermediary within Charles's office, someone whose discretion had been tested many times before. That intermediary made the decision, one that would later be scrutinized heavily within the household, to bring the letter directly to Charles, rather than routing it through the normal channels that typically handle sensitive correspondence involving the family. The reasoning, as it was later explained, was straightforward. A document like this touched Charles personally, in a way that made it inappropriate to process through an administrative system before he had even seen it. Charles read it alone. According to the account of the person who delivered it, he asked to be left with it in private, and remained in that small room at Sandringham for nearly 2 hours before summoning anyone. What he did during those 2 hours has not been described by anyone who was present, for the simple reason that no one was present. But when he finally opened the door, those waiting outside noted an expression they struggled to characterize precisely. Not anger, not devastation, something closer to the specific, quiet disorientation of a man discovering that a story he believed he understood completely had, in fact, contained a chapter he had never been shown. He did not confront Camilla immediately. This detail matters enormously, because it tells you something about how Charles processes difficult information, a pattern that has held consistent across decades of documented royal crises. He does not react in the moment. He absorbs, considers, and only then decides how to proceed, often taking days or weeks before addressing even the most urgent matters directly with the person involved. Sources close to the household describe him spending nearly a full week with the knowledge of the letter's existence before he raised it with Camilla at all, a week during which he continued to appear beside her at public engagements with no visible alteration in his manner, no hint to the household staff, who worked closely with both of them, that anything had changed. But what happened next is the part that has genuinely unsettled people inside the palace, because it did not unfold the way anyone anticipated. When Charles finally raised the letter with Camilla, in a private conversation that took place at Birkhall, rather than at any of the more formal royal residences, her response was not denial. According to sources with knowledge of that conversation, she did not attempt to claim the letter was misremembered, exaggerated, or taken out of context, the kinds of defenses that would have been available to her, and that many in her position might have reached for instinctively. Instead, she reportedly acknowledged writing it, acknowledged the sentiments it expressed, and offered Charles something considerably more complicated than either a confession or a justification. She offered him an explanation of the woman she had been at the time she wrote it, and asked him to consider what that woman had actually been facing. She had been, in the years surrounding that letter, a person whose public existence consisted almost entirely of being blamed for the collapse of the most scrutinized marriage in modern British history. She could not walk into a shop without calculation, could not attend a public event without the possibility of hostility, could not, in the most basic sense, simply exist without the weight of a national narrative that had cast her as its villain. The letter, she reportedly explained, was not a campaign strategy written by a woman coldly calculating her assent. It was, in her account, closer to a survival document, a private assertion of self-worth written to a trusted friend during a period when almost nobody else in her life was willing to grant her any version of a future that did not involve permanent public contempt. Whether Charles found that explanation convincing is something sources describe in more ambiguous terms than the rest of this account. He reportedly told her he understood the impulse behind it, understood what it meant to need, in your darkest years, some private articulation of a future better than your present circumstances suggested was possible. But understanding the impulse and accepting the specific content of what she had written are not the same thing, and people close to Charles describe him wrestling, in the weeks that followed, with a distinction he found genuinely difficult to resolve. The difference between a woman hoping, in private desperation, for eventual acceptance, and a woman calculating, with strategic precision, the exact mechanisms by which that acceptance could be engineered. We need to talk about William now, because his reaction to learning of the letter's existence has, according to multiple sources, been considerably more difficult to manage than his father's. William was not told immediately. Charles, according to people familiar with his thinking, wanted time to process the letter's implications privately, before bringing his son into a conversation that he understood would carry weight beyond the immediate question of Camilla's private ambitions decades ago. When William was eventually informed, roughly 3 weeks after Charles first read the letter, his response was described by one source as controlled in the specific way that masks genuine anger rather than the absence of it. William's relationship with Camilla has always existed within a careful architecture of public correctness, layered over a private history that neither of them has ever fully addressed. He has, for more than 2 decades, extended her the outward forms of familial acceptance, has stood beside her at ceremonies, has allowed the public narrative of a functioning blended family to solidify around images that required considerable private discipline from everyone involved to maintain. The letter, according to sources close to him, has complicated that discipline in a way he has not yet fully worked through. What troubles William most, according to people who have spoken with him about it, is not the letter's content in isolation. It is what the letter suggests about the years of gradual public rehabilitation he watched unfold throughout his own adolescence and early adulthood, years he had understood, in the story he told himself about his own family, as simply the slow, organic process of 2 people who loved each other finding their way toward eventual acceptance. The letter reframes that entire narrative as something considerably less organic, something with strategic architecture behind it, from a much earlier point than he had ever imagined. He is now confronting the possibility that moments he remembers as spontaneous, warm, genuine, were positioned within a longer, more deliberate campaign than he understood at the time. That reframing matters enormously to a man who has spent his adult life building an institution around the principle that authenticity and documentation should align, that the gap between private truth and public presentation should be as narrow as the monarchy's survival allows. William has never been comfortable with the idea that image management and genuine feeling might be difficult to distinguish from each other in his own family's history. The letter has forced that discomfort into the open in a way that no amount of institutional discipline can fully contain. Here is the part nobody inside the palace wants discussed publicly, and the reason this story has been managed with such extraordinary care since the letter first surfaced. William reportedly raised, in a private conversation with his father, a question that has apparently gone unanswered for weeks now. If Camilla's path to the throne was, even in part, the product of deliberate strategic patience, rather than the simple accumulation of time and circumstance, what does that suggest about the reliability of every account the family has told itself about how difficult periods in its history actually unfolded? It is a question with implications reaching well beyond Camilla specifically, one that touches the entire mythology the institution has built around itself, the careful public narrative in which every difficult chapter eventually resolves into simple, uncomplicated forgiveness and acceptance, rather than anything as uncomfortable as calculation. Catherine's involvement in this has been quieter than William's, but sources describe her playing a specific and important role in how the family has begun processing the letter's implications. She was told relatively early, within days of William learning of it, and her initial response, according to one account, was to ask a question that neither Charles nor William had apparently considered directly. Not whether the letter proved something troubling about Camilla's character, but what practical consequence, if any, its existence should actually carry now, more than 2 decades after it was written, for a marriage and a public role that had, by any reasonable measure, been sustained successfully for years, regardless of the private thinking that may have shaped its beginning. That question, pragmatic in a way that reflects Catherine's particular value within the family's internal decision-making, has apparently done more to calm the immediate crisis than any of the more emotionally charged conversations that preceded it. She reportedly told William, in a private exchange, that people are frequently more calculating in private than they ever allow themselves to appear in public, and that judging Camilla's entire subsequent conduct against the standard of a single letter written during her most vulnerable and uncertain years risked applying a standard that almost nobody, including members of their own family, could survive if applied with equal rigor to their private correspondence from difficult periods of their own lives. Whether that framing genuinely resolved William's discomfort or simply gave him a way to set it aside for the moment is something sources describe differently depending on who is doing the describing. What is clear is that the family has, for now, chosen not to let the letter become a public crisis. There has been no statement, no acknowledgement, no indication to the wider public that any of this conversation has taken place. The letter remains, as far as anyone outside the small circle who knows of its existence is concerned, exactly what it always was. A private document, unremarked upon, sitting quietly wherever it has now been secured. But something has shifted, according to every source who has described the weeks following its discovery, in the texture of how Charles and Camilla relate to each other in private. Charles has not confronted her publicly, has not altered his outward devotion in any way visible to staff or observers. But those closest to the couple describe a new carefulness in his manner around her, a quality one source described as the particular attentiveness of a man reassessing, without wanting to admit he is reassessing, a history he had believed he understood completely. Camilla, for her part, has reportedly said very little further on the subject since that initial conversation at Birkhall. She has not sought to reopen the discussion, has not attempted additional explanation or justification beyond what she offered in that first exchange. Sources close to her describe this restraint as characteristic rather than evasive, consistent with a woman who has spent decades understanding that over-explaining a difficult truth rarely improves how it lands, and that dignity, in moments like this, often means allowing an explanation to stand once offered, rather than returning to it repeatedly in search of a version that lands more comfortably. What she has done, according to one account, is quietly increase the frequency of her private conversations with William specifically, small, unscheduled moments that carry none of the formal weight of an official reconciliation attempt, but that appear, in their accumulation, to represent a deliberate effort to rebuild something that the letter's discovery has, at minimum, complicated. Whether William has responded to these overtures with genuine warmth or with the practiced correctness that royal life so often requires, regardless of private feeling, is something even sources close to both of them describe as difficult to assess with confidence. The wider question this entire episode raises, one that people inside the institution have apparently begun discussing in more abstract terms even as they avoid discussing the letter itself directly, is about the nature of ambition inside a family whose entire public identity depends on appearing to be above it. The monarchy survives, in significant part, on a mythology of duty over desire, of individuals subordinating personal want to institutional necessity. Camilla's letter, if its contents are accurately described, suggests a more complicated reality, one in which personal desire and institutional necessity were, for at least one crucial period, working in careful alignment, rather than in the tension the public mythology assumes. That is not necessarily a scandal in any conventional sense. Ambition is not, on its own, a moral failing, and a woman calculating her path toward acceptance after enduring years of public vilification is engaged in something considerably more sympathetic than the word ambition typically implies when applied to royal life. But it does complicate the specific story the family has told about itself. The story of two people whose relationship survived not because either of them fought for a particular outcome, but because time and circumstance eventually delivered them both to a place of settled, uncomplicated legitimacy. There is one further detail worth sitting with before we close, because it may end up mattering more than anything else in this story. The letter, according to the single source who has described its final lines in any detail, ends not with a statement of certainty, but with a question. One Camilla apparently posed to herself in writing, decades before anyone else was asking it of her publicly. Whether the future she was describing to her friend was one she genuinely believed she deserved, or one she had simply decided, after years of public punishment for a private choice, that she would no longer allow herself to feel guilty about wanting. That distinction between deserving and simply deciding to stop apologizing is the one Charles has reportedly found himself returning to in the weeks since he first read her words. It is the one William is still working through, in conversations that happen quietly, away from any camera or official record. And it may be the one that ultimately determines whether this letter becomes, in the long history of this family, a private wound that eventually heals into understanding, or a fracture that widens slowly, in ways nobody inside those walls has yet found the language to fully name. Thanks for watching. If this story moves forward, we'll be here to cover it. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next.